Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Renaissance Room. As you guys know, we have been here and it's been rough and when I say rough, I mean like this is just the raw, unedited, we're just vibing out. It's almost like you're sitting in my living room, quite literally. You sometimes hear my baby, she's a vocalist, shall I say. And so yeah, the vibes. I gotta say, I love this just rawness of it all. I think something I'm really proud of, and you start talking about like content creation, is just consistency. Consistency. I feel like I've grown so much as a podcaster, as a creator, as a writer. And I'm just very proud of that. I really am. And I'm looking into screenwriting, I would love to be in film. And so I was just sitting here brainstorming, thinking about my collegiate journey and just how long it's taken. How long it's taken and how, women who are studious, the sacrifices that we make, for this time. I mean, when you think about it, if you're constantly in school, you have no time for family. It's a huge sacrifice. And I don't think we talk about it enough. I don't think there's any language to describe it because it is the American way, right? If you want to be successful, you go about the institutions and such and you build, and I was not the type of person to take any shortcuts, but, just knowing that with minors and majors and just adding more and more time into just being more studious and just learning, I'm like, okay, I think it's time for me to try to find an outlet to kind of just do instead of just constantly hitting the books, right? I'm always on the books. I've been on the books, and I think it's great though. I feel like there's a lot to learn, and I'm willing to learn. I'm humble enough to recognize I don't know everything and I'm not there, and it's a continuous process. Oh, simultaneously admitting your girl is tired, very tired. And so just kind of looking at Courtney A. Kemp and, I was watching Power and just sort of like the debriefing behind the scenes and just her explaining the process and the characters and all the different things. And it was just so amazing. One thing that I love about film, and I'll just go ahead and share, it's just the work. It's the brilliance of it all. I think when you think about all the moving parts that really go into cinematic production, from the writers to the actors to the emotion to the storytelling, and just how, I was watching Moonlight, just kind of looking at it from more of a studious perspective and not just kind of like watching the film, but really like engaging with the film. And, I just think there's something so cool in how it's the events outside of the character that oftentimes introduce the character. You know what I mean? It's like that scene where you'll see the girl that's getting on the train in New York, but instead of before you see the girl who may be disheveled or may have more of a hard pressed, you know what I mean? You don't have to say it, right? What you see is the subway. What you see is kind of like this dreary, environment that is a little rough. You know what I mean? And so I just love that. I think it's so cool. And so that's kind of just what I've been venturing in. I know for the longest of times I've been classifying myself as a hobbyist, but I mean, this is really me pursuing my dreams. I did have to pivot, and I am currently pivoting as I'm navigating motherhood and so many different things, in addition to, just not really having the support. And I think that is a conversation for another day. I could really sit and talk about, when we talk about support, there was a moment on Instagram where I think within the Black community, a lot of people started talking about normalizing, family members and friends not supporting you and, recognizing that your audience is strangers and things like that. And I just think about the many adaptations we have to undergo as African-American people who just don't have support. I look at some of these mediocre creators in my city, the mediocre writers and so forth. And I'm not here to be like a hater on anybody, and I'm not trying to come off as like racist, so I want to be mindful of how I say this, but just to kind of just be blunt, it's so interesting to see how people are able to get projects up and off the ground very easily, and so it's really sad, the adaptation that we have to undergo as African Americans, to where we just kind of have to work around. I also want to say too, I think for myself, just if I'm being honest, Well, I'm always honest. But for myself, I am not the type of person to say, hey, let's collaborate when I have nothing. You know what I mean? I don't believe in conversation as collaboration. Conversation is great. I think it's an amazing thing to be able to bounce ideas. But I think we start talking about creative efforts and projects and support. I think people need to know what you're doing and how they can support that, right? And like, if people don't know what it is that you're doing and you can't funnel that for them and convey that in a way that is understood, and you can't tell them what their contributions are and how they can help you and, bring in what they do and what you do in terms of like something collaborative. I just think it's a waste of time. Like, networking today is more so about posturing, and I'm not really in the business of that, and I'm not someone to be like, hey, because I've done that before. Let me take a sip of my coffee. One moment, please. You guys hear my ice cubes clinking? Yeah, it's very bougie. Very, very, very fab. Okay, this is so good. Like, I've been doing iced coffee from home, and I never even really was an iced coffee type of girl. I'm more of a iced Americano. But I was like, I'm going to try to make some coffee from home. I love Starbucks creamer. But as you know, I'm postpartum, so I've been trying to like chill on the sugar and like knock these pregnancy cravings. And so I tried this sugar-free caramel macchiato, and that's usually what I used to get at Starbucks, mostly because I didn't really know what else to get. And it's just delicious. Sidebar. So anyway, I just don't believe in concerted efforts into networking when you have nothing to build, when there's nothing, you don't know what you need people for. And so the example I was giving, and this is something I've learned in business and just through my own personal endeavors, when I started my nonprofit, and I was going around and I was trying to connect with people. I was essentially trying to network with people. And it just was like, I didn't have anything for people to come in and help with. I was still in the building stages. And at the time, I really went into the nonprofit sector very naive. Very naive, to say the least. I had taught at a community center where I just kind of did a 4-week program that was something that I tailored specifically to these kids and to my, my freelance career as a writer, so to speak. And so I just thought that, hey, this will be great. I can do this, But when I say it is so much on the back end, and that kind of brings me to this point that I kind of want to talk about too, now that we're just kind of getting into it. Is I think for so many Black entrepreneurs and business owners, there is a sense of naivete that really is so normalized when you start talking about business, right? It's the shortcomings that affect everybody around them. You know what I mean? And what I mean is, so often you have these business owners, such as myself, this is a prime example. You walk into these industries and you want to do the thing and you want to build the thing, but you're just not ready. And that's why for me, it's like I complain that it's taken me so long. I grieve that this process is very strenuous, and it's just like a lot of studious, a lot of like academic based type work. But I really want to be prepared. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's my biggest thing. I want to be prepared for the opportunity when it comes. And so, for example, I think I made a podcast. I might have talked to you guys about this already, but maybe not. There's a Black-owned grocery store that opened up in a food desert, and a lot of raving about it. I did an interview with the founder, or rather the owner, who started at the local market, and there was a small business stand. It was actually a specialty in meats, and like deli products, not necessarily a full-blown grocery store. And so fast forward, they get this $2 million loan, grant or whatever, and they want to open up a business. They open up this Black-owned business. It's branded as a Black-owned grocery store in a food desert. And by the sounds of it, it's like, wow, this is incredible. You know what I mean? This is long overdue. It is much needed. A lot of, how it is if you're living in the ghetto, or if you're in urban communities, there is food deserts, and it's not just in like the middle of Milwaukee. You know what I mean? It's like in every city almost. And so it's much needed, And so anyway, fast forward, here we are today. I think the grocery store has probably been open maybe a year and a half or maybe less. And it took forever for them to get this store open, right? This store has been sitting idle for so many summers. And they finally get the store open, and there's no product. right? There's no product. The shelves are very scarce. The food is not, they got some ready-made items, but it's nothing that's like fresh. Some of the items look expired. The vegetables are not fresh. The produce isn't fresh. And so this brings me to question all the narratives that we have around African Americans in business, right? The narrative today is, well, Black people can't get loans to start business. Well, that's not true. That's not true, right? These are two owners who got a loan for $2 million, and they were able to literally open up a grocery store, right? But here it is, they get the loan, the grocery store is open, and why are we not seeing any products on the shelves? You would think the first thought for a lot of people, at least for myself, it was like, well, what's going on with that? What's going on with that? Are they having a hard time, with inventory? Is it some type of thing, and your mind wants to go to racism. But when you start thinking more critically, it's like, well, wait a minute. These are two founders of a small, what do you want to call it? Front end stands, at the local market selling meat and deli products. So when you start talking about was it a franchise? You're talking about like business, like a grocery store. You're talking about SKU numbers, inventory, stock, front end management, all these different things. You start talking about marketing, development, all these different things. The ball has completely dropped. Why has it completely dropped? Because they don't have the skill set to do what it is that they're doing, right? And so it's unfortunate because I think that this is what happens. And so now with this grocery store, I don't know where these founders are, right? You walk into the store, there's no product. You know what I mean? Everybody's still greeting and riding the high of it being a Black-owned grocery store. But at the end of the day, the community that it was supposed to serve has been ultimately let down, right? You start looking at things too, like, you talk about market development within that specific area and that demographic. If we know a lot of people are relying on EBT, do we have a lot of products in here that are for, WIC customers or EBT customers? You see what I'm saying? Like, what are we doing, right? If you're serving a lot of ready-made packaged goods, a lot of that stuff cannot be used with EBT or with WIC. So it's just like the lack of market research overall is going to be the downfall of this business, and it's the downfall of so many of our businesses. And so we're quick to say Black people are not getting ahead, but the reality is that many of us are just not doing the work of preparation. So I say all that to say, just tying it into my personal experience as a writer, as a creator, it's like you got to pay your dues, and I'm sitting here venting with you guys, low key complaining, well, I won't say complaining, but, just kind of venting and speaking to the realities that, like, it's a long process. Like I said, I was just looking at Courtney Kemp, and like, Courtney didn't get on power until like her 40s. You know what I mean? And like, there's just so much work that has to be done before we arrive, before we brand ourselves as these owners, as the Black-owned grocery store or this founder of this nonprofit. Like, there's so much that goes in the back end. And when you really sit with that, you recognize that many of us just don't have that type of background, right? That studious background that really trains us and prepares us for long hours of study, right? And even if you are an entrepreneur, it's still study because you need to be doing market research. Okay, what are we doing for this month? For the front end, okay, who's managing what? How are we going to be acknowledging our employees? What are some, you know what I mean? Like, there's so much that goes into that. And when you start talking about a grocery store, that's no small feat, and so I just think that for a lot of people, and these could also just be people who we're looking for a cash grab, if we're being honest. A lot of persons who kind of brand themselves as Black owned, I hate to say it, but a lot of times, people are really preying on the needs of these communities. They're playing on representation. Right now we've been working towards like building representation and having conversations around, positive representation and so forth. And so I think a lot of people really use this branding as like Black owned to exploit a lot of the persons within the community. You can kind of see this with some business owners of small products, right? They will, target the, Black people. Obviously, they're African American themselves. I think about some of the top influencers who've kind of have like this more of a certain type of presentation that we know is not anything that is diversified, right? And so we know that a large sum of their income comes from African American communities, right? These are girls, these are men who cannot market to any other demographic. And when you look at their products are just exorbitant, in terms of pricing. You start talking about relatability or how they connect with those in the community. negativity, it's often from a space of like invoking emotions of envy or, shame. For you start talking about a person's economic situations and positionings. Like, I just think that we're at a point where I just kind of feel like we have to kind of start calling these things out, because I think the only persons who are being harmed is African Americans. And I think we've turned a blind eye to the perpetual harm within our community for so long that a lot of people are sitting here kind of dumbfounded and wanting to know what are the wanting answers to the questions, right? Like, and we're not asking the right questions anymore. It's no longer the system that is keeping us down. You know what I mean? It's the people who are in position and who may have the resources or the opportunities who are then exploiting those for economic gain, right? For financial gain, for their own personal pockets, right? Like, where are these grocery store founders? Why has there been months, rather, I ain't gonna say weeks, it's been months, seriously, and there's no products on the shelves? You know what I mean? Why are we going to the grocery store and there's a bunch of food in here that people within this area, you know what I mean, with this geographical location, do not eat this type of food? You know what I mean? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? And so I just think that a lot of times for a lot of people, it's a money grab, and I know sometimes we don't want to sit in that space because it's like, oh, we're Black people, Black power, Black business. But it's like, no, we got to kind of start looking at all the ways in which for a lot of people, they have adopted or rather succumbed to this type of like patriarchal capitalistic thinking. And a lot of people do not have the best interest in heart of those in the communities that they claim to serve. And a big reason for that is, like I said, a lack of resources. So back to what I was saying, I don't want to veer too far left. It's a lack of resources, y'all. It takes a lot to really build something. I know persons who have nonprofits and they were in church communities, so they were able to kind of build that nonprofit and scale it pretty quickly. You can get people in position to be, where they need to be, and people who are, ample and adequate in their skill set. Like, it's a long process, and I think this goes for men and women. For a lot of us, you start talking about coupling and marriage and things like that. Many people don't have a safety net, so a lot of people are getting on the road to build these futures that are very costly, in terms of time. And so you just really don't have time for family. You don't have time for, any of those things. And for the people who have been kind of, acquiring responsibilities since they were very young and are now prioritizing stability and security, it's really hard to kind of set time aside to build your dream, So I just want to say that I totally resonate with a lot of people out there. I no longer have this attitude, because I think this is another very prevalent but immature ideology that is, within our community as well. And it's not just in the community. I think it's a paradigm that kind of operates within the younger generations. And it's this idea of like, well, I don't want to work a 9-to-5. I want to start a business. You know what I mean? But there's so many things. Like, I think when you start talking about business, it's been glamorized. So everything that's going on the back end, you don't see. Like, you don't see the accounting. You know what I mean? You don't see the inventory. You don't see the meetings where you have to really sit and like figure out, what are we going to do with this inventory? How are we going to market this? Like, you don't see all that goes into that, right? And then you start talking about our proxy to celebrities and our parasocial relationship with influencers, and it's like, at this point, it's like we're just really coasting on fantasy, So a lot of people have big dreams, but they don't know the work that it takes to get there, And this is not necessarily like a faith thing to where you hold on. This is like, I'm just being real with you. Like, it's really hard. You know what I mean? It's really hard. It's very tedious. I feel like there was a point where millennials and those of older generations would come out and kind of speak, and whether it's from, a celebrity or a motivational speaker, and they would talk about the hard work, But that's just something that's so outdated today. We don't want hard work. We want smart. We want convenient. We want ease, but we just don't have those conversations anymore. And I just think it sets a lot of people up for perpetual disappointment. And then those who do get a position, I think it sets the stage for a normalization of exploitation, because these persons are not knowledgeable in what it is that they're doing, but they know the right language, right? They know how to talk the language of justice, right? Ooh, Black-owned grocery store in this particular type of community, but they're not doing the back end work, And I would say that that's exploitation, because you start talking about negligence. That's got to, somebody has to be held accountable for that. You know what I mean? I just think far too often that's what it is. And I think too, what's another thing that I wanted to say? I don't want to veer. I'm going to kind of stay focused. I'm going to wrap up on this topic, because I was actually coming on here to talk about some of the reasons, why I just think relationships and dating is a little bit more complicated. I don't know if we're still having these conversations. I'm just coming on for something a little bit more lighthearted, although I don't have to. I mean, I could come into something a little bit more, but I'm just coming on to kind of create something a little bit more lighthearted, just given all things considered. So I don't know if we're still having these conversations about dating. I don't know if people are still, I think people are mostly just prioritizing their families, their finances right now. I don't even think that dating and such is still a thing. But I do want to kind of speak to those who do find themselves in this space and they have questions. So what I feel and what I wrote about on my Substack is that, dating is complicated because people bring their own expectations into a thing. And when you start talking about expectations, I'm not saying that from like a very surface level blanket statement. I'm saying it from the state of from the standpoint of, I just think that people are looking for themselves in other people, and then I think when you start talking about hedonism, I think in part, yes, you start talking about individualism, but I think that we're also kind of in a space where people are finding themselves and discovering themselves and figuring out what makes them happy. And I don't think that that's hedonistic. I think that that's very healthy, and obviously I'm not talking about people who just prioritize their happiness over everybody else, but I'm talking about people who really take the time to do the work, because what's very evident to me is that people no longer want to partner with people just because they're of the opposite sex. You know what I mean? People no longer want to partner with people just because, it's like, this makes sense. Or you're lonely, I'm lonely, you're single, I'm single. Like, people want to be with people who know themselves. And I just think when you just don't know yourself, it's really hard to partner with someone like that. I think a lot of people, think that relationships are kind of like this thing of ease, and I think for the people who think like that, I think there's an undercurrent of immaturity. They've never really developed, they've never really grown. And this is something that's prevalent in people of all ages, 20s, 30s, and 40s. People think that it's just supposed to be this like, okay, you like me, I like you, I'm going to get with you. You know what I mean? Like, that's like this high school attitude that just never really drifts, and never really shifts. And life isn't like that. Dating isn't like that, and I would even speak to traditionalism. A lot of people today think that when it comes to being in a relationship, it's like, oh, okay, well, if I'm a man, I make money, I deserve X, Y, and Z. And it's the same for women. Women think, oh, I'm a good woman, or, oh, I know how to cook, I know how to clean. Then this is what, makes me qualify for a specific type of partner. But I would argue and let people know that, hey, listen, people are no longer looking for these kind of like domestications. We're living in a day and age where traditionalism isn't really going to cut it. People aren't really looking to fit those type of models anymore, and so if you as a man or a woman and you think, oh, just because I have money or because I know how to cook. Like, first of all, when it comes to Instagram, it's very easy to learn how to cook today. Like if you just a little effort, you know what I mean? And a willingness to try, you could easily find a recipe and have something tasty tonight, So those standards, requirements, expectations are no longer flattering. And then when I think you start talking about money, obviously we know that women are making their own money. So, and women are becoming more knowledgeable about, the power imbalance that can sometimes be present when women don't make money, right? Or vice versa. And so I just think that it's only as complicated as we make it. And I just think that if more people spent time really getting to know themselves and really working on their own personal dysfunction, especially in the Black community, we just got to be honest, we got a lot of dysfunction here. A lot of dysfunction. I'm not talking about any other cultures. I'm not comparing. Okay. This is not to contrast. This is just to say, hey, listen, Black people, we are dysfunctional. We got some things we got to work on, and I just think if people would focus more on the dysfunction that they bring into the lives of other people, then I think people would have no chance partnering. I think beliefs about, it not being enough good men, beliefs about high earning men, beliefs about women with children, like all those things are just narratives that are created to disempower women and men. I don't think any of those things really hold true in terms of like mating and values and, potential partnering. I think that so much of it has to do with your personal dysfunction. People think that, hey, you're going to get with the person and it's going to be smooth sailing. And it's like, no, you have to bring substance, right? Substance looks like, do you know who you are? You know what I mean? Substance looks like having relational tools to navigate conflict, to navigate, a relationship. You know what I mean? We're humans. We change, we grow, develop. Do you have the skills to cultivate something? You know, like most people don't. You know, most people can't even stick with something for, you know how it is. Okay. So I say all that to say, I just think that, you know, there really is something in being the best you. I don't think that you are worthy of love when you arrive, but the reality is that when you arrive, you are whole, and the person you become is someone so different. And so you have a completely different picking, you know what I mean, versus someone who met you when you were survival mode, when you were struggling, when you were, you know, and, you know, that brings me to those conversations too about like men who leave women and so forth. Again, that traditional model, you know, women put themselves in those situations, and I'm not going to say put themselves in those situations, but women who find themselves in those situations, it's really based on this idea that as a woman, I have to stand here and serve in this traditional role, you know, and that traditional role is sticking by somebody while they build their dreams and you know, bury yours. And so, of course, that creates an imbalance, you know, and inevitably when that person arrives at their dream, that could be man or woman, you know, they change, they're different, you know, because the work that they were putting in, you know, the everything that they were, you know, seeing in the world and so forth, it changes you. And so now you're at this crossroads where there's this huge incompatibility. And that can go from on your way up the ladder or, you know, hey, just average folk, you know, day to day, you know. So we change when we grow, when we become, you know, the type of people that we personally respect and admire. And so I just think that you should focus on that. And then you say if that's hedonistic, I don't know. You know, I just think that this is obviously, we know it's kind of been this way since, you know, materialism and capitalism was normalized from the church to the culture to so forth. But I just think that there's not such a bad thing in being people who are, you know, persons of self-agency. You know, I just don't think there's anything wrong with that. I really don't. I think because of technology, you know, I think that we have a culture that we've always had a country that's based on convenience. You know, many of our inventions are based on convenience, but I just think we're at a point now where, you know, it's more convenience, you know? And so I think that, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say, because I feel like I'm veering and I don't want to go too far left, but I just think what I'm trying to say is that I think as we get older, you know, as we grow older, I just think we have to take responsibility for our lives. You know, I think we have to take responsibility for our lives, for the choices that we've made. I think for the persons who have made some pretty altering choices very early on, I think you have to practice self-forgiveness. I think you have to undergo therapy. I think you have to undergo radical self-acceptance and compassion. And I just think you have to kind of accept your life and move on with it. You know, it's an unfortunate thing. Like I said, I think for many African Americans, we acquire responsibilities at such an early age, whether that's multiple children, whether that's, you know, unfortunately for some, well, I don't want to say unfortunately, but, you know, some of us are caretakers. Like, the story is different for many people, you know, but I do think that there just kind of gets a point where you start talking about healing. And I think there's a point where you kind of start talking about just kind of like embracing your lot and accepting your lot and figuring out how you can make do with what you got, you know, how you can move around with what you got. You know, there's something that you have, you know what I mean? Seriously, that you can do, whether it's gardening, that can bring you joy and possibly a little bit of income, you know. I think another thing too, and that's a perfect example of like making do with what you got, regardless of what you've done, you know. But I think that's a perfect example of, you know, the reasons why we shouldn't be so integrated with celebrities, you know. I mean, even for myself, right? I'm talking about screenwriting and all these different things. When, you know, you think of like Hollywood, right? Initially you think of LA, but it might ultimately just be small town indie type of projects, you know. And I think it's okay to have the ability to dream, but I also think it's important to be so grounded in your reality and so content with yourself, you know, and not really base your worth on whether or not I do make it to LA as a screenwriter, you know what I mean? Or whether or not I do make it to wherever, you know what I mean? Because that's the big dream, right? And I don't think that's necessarily a plan B per se, but I just think that we kind of have to get to this place where I feel like we have this ability to dream, you know, we have this ability to, be emboldened in certain, you know, representations and, you know, feel a sense of aspiration for, you know, our proxy to celebrities and the things that we see online. But I also think there's really something so grounding in being able to say, hey, listen, this is my life, this is my lot, and I can be content with a little bit. You know what I mean? And I know that's like Bible, but that's so real though. I feel like there's so much wisdom in that, like I know right now we've been talking a lot about relationships and not just romantic ones. It's like, hey, perhaps you may not have this particular partner or this particular spouse, but can you be content with those who are in your network? Can you be content with the friends and the family that is around you? Maybe it's not just family, but perhaps it is a friend of the opposite sex. Like, you know what I mean? Like, can you be content in these relational dynamics? Like, I just think that those are the conversations that we can really start having if we are to heal and if we are to become more psychologically healthy, because I think at the end of the day, we're all working towards our own dreams, goals, and aspirations. But at the end of the day, we do have to accept the fact that, this is American exceptionalism that a lot of us are chasing after, and it doesn't mean don't try. It just means, hey, listen, if it never got to be that, can you be content with, your YouTube, channel? Can you be content with that podcast community that you've created? Can you be content with vacations to LA? Can you be content? Like, you know what I mean? Like, can you be content with it not looking that way? Because the reality is that, like, that was never anything that was promised. That was something that was carefully curated. That was something that was crafted. That was something that was depicted and projected onto you, but it was never a promise that was yours, And I think we start talking about reality and just being like emotionally healthy and psychologically healthy. I think that could be a really grounding thing for a lot of people, because a lot of people are stepping over those within their community to get to this aspiration that they have no idea the back end, they have no idea what it takes to get to that space and to be in those particular specific type of rooms. And even if you get in that type of room, it's like, are you prepared? Are you ready? Have you built something that's sturdy and, you know what I mean? To say, hey, this is what I am. This is what I do, and then additionally, I think it's important for a lot of people who I would even consider myself, I'll go ahead and throw myself in there, a little bit of like an indie, a small space, you know what I mean? Like, can we acknowledge the fact that there are some great people doing dope things who are not famous, who are not influencers, who do not have large platforms? You know what I mean? Can we acknowledge that there are some amazing commentators who do not have a microphone on, the local news channel? You know what I mean? Can we acknowledge that? Can we acknowledge some amazing newsletters, whether it's Substack or columns on, Medium that have never made it to the New York Times or the Atlantic? You know what I mean? Like, can we acknowledge that stuff can be good without it being publicly known? I think sometimes we forgot that, it's like, can you acknowledge that you have an amazing husband? You know what I mean? Even though, in the traditional sense, he's not this patriarchal, rich dude, can you acknowledge the fact that you have an amazing wife who, isn't necessarily this, this girl on Instagram, like, can we acknowledge one another without the glitz and glam? And I think that that's something that we really need. I think people need to be seen. People need to be seen. Are we seeing one another? The answer is no, we're not seeing one another. I feel like when you meet people today, you don't even get to just sit down and have a general conversation. Like, everything is about posturing, positioning. It's almost like we're taking a photo for Instagram. Like, it's crazy in the way in which we engage in dialogue today. It's like, hey, listen, I'm just asking you, how was your day? I'm curious as to, your profession, because I like writing. This is what I like to do. This, what do you like to do? You know what I mean? Like, we no longer go about the world with that sense of curiosity. I don't think it's hedonism. I think it's fear. People are so deeply afraid of being rejected. And I don't even know since when did rejection become the like ultimate depths of hell? Like, I don't get it. When did we arrive at that place? Sociologically, when did we get to the point where rejection was just the worst thing in the world? So it's interesting, but I think it's important to be aware of how, these paradigms shape us and how prevalent they are in the world around us, because it's very common. It's very common. The way we socialize with one another today, it's so different. We don't meet. I think people would have a better chance connecting with one another if they would meet one another where they are, in your work and in your hobbies, in your interest, in your family, you know what I mean? In your life, in your past, your present, your future. Like, who are you? You know what I mean? Not, who do you think you should be? Not who do you want to be? You know what I mean? But who are you? and I think that that's something that a lot of people struggle with, because much of that is not, if it's not a platform or something like that, they feel like they have no reason to be proud of who they are, and that's what sucks, and so people no longer put pride in their work. People no longer take the time to really, like, go all in the stuff that they love. Everything is kind of like half baked. And we get upset when we get those results, and, we wonder why we're not proud, and we have that sense of insecurity, or we're not carrying ourselves with a sense of dignity. When we show up, we're kind of like cowering, or we're, projecting, and we're insecure, and we're jealous, and, we're mean, and unkind. But those things don't shape you at the end of the day. They really don't. They really don't, because, when you really just kind of let the curtain fall, it's just stuff, it's just like accessories at the end of the day, So this is obviously coming from a writer. So I don't want to take too much of you guys' time, but I just kind of want to just talk about, like, connecting and sharing some of my new interest, and, I guess what I'm hoping for the future. What I'm hoping for the future. I think it's easy to meet people who have similar interests. I think something I will share for myself, you start talking about, venturing out of the familiar and the comfortable. There were times where I was in rooms and it was awkward. I felt like I was this Black writer, and I was freelance, and I was amongst all of these persons who had college degrees, and they were white. And, I felt like I had to be something else. I didn't feel good enough in my work, even though I was hired, because of my work, not because of the degree that I didn't even have at the time, and that felt like too much for me. You know what I mean? That felt like too much for me. I didn't know how to just kind of sit and be present and be grounded. But I think that's one of the beautiful things about life. It's like we can grow from experiences, and I've grown so much from that. And, my attitude and my positioning towards other ethnic groups, it's changed a lot, and so I think it's a beautiful thing to grow. I think I have to give glory to God. I really do, because I look back over my life. I don't know how I got here. The way I sound, it's so different from anything that I've, like, created before. And just to know that I'm growing, I just think that's such a beautiful thing. I love growth. I think it's so beautiful. And so I'm grateful to be where I am today. And, I'll end with this, for anybody who's ashamed of where they've been, or, experiences, or motherhood, or whatever the case may be, and honestly, one day we're going to talk about the fact that with all the dysfunction within the Black community, how Black men walk away with no shame ever, even if they are the perpetuators of that dysfunction, even if they too possess this dysfunction, how Black women carry the shame for the entire community. We'll talk about that later. But allow life to transform you. I think life is to be lived. I think I read that in a book by Eckhart Tolle, like a long time ago, back when I was on my spiritual journey with my Oprah craze and my Wayne Dyer. I think that life is truly to be lived. And I think that there's something so beautiful in allowing life to do what life does. Now I will say for myself, I used to kind of walk into difficult situations, because I did want to grow, but I realized that wasn't necessarily wise, meaning that you don't have to be the cause of the chaos in your life, because it's going to, life is going to do what life is going to do anyway. So you can just kind of allow life to life if you just live it. But I just think there's something so beautiful about certain experiences in your life that can change you. Me personally, I don't know, you guys. I think obviously it's God's plan, but I'm grateful for my lot. And when I say lot, I mean like life, my portion, my experiences, my everything, I'm grateful for it, because I never really wanted like a linear life. I didn't really want like a perfect life, although I do see some people who did kind of have that. Like they went to a good school, they landed a good job, they have a great partner, they both share the same interests. Like, I do admire that. I think it's really admirable, but I feel like, I just think there's something in being so well-rounded and going through so many different things. And, I don't know. I like it. I like it. I've grown to like it. I used to be so ashamed of my messy story, and now I'm like, man, it's pretty cool. You know what I mean? I'm just out here living life, I'm just out here living life, and it's beautiful. So that's the message for today. I look forward to trying something new. I know I kind of started off with sharing some of my new interests and then kind of veered, but y'all know how we do. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast episode. I hope you guys have an amazing week. I really hope that your days get brighter. I really hope that you start to see your life from a completely different perspective. I'll end by saying this too, because I just thought of this. For a lot of the women today, I got to make another podcast episode for that. Now we got to make another pod. You guys have a great day. Peace.